the sweet spot for me has been a company that's maybe 3 or 4 years old and sort of in the 70 to 110 person range in terms of size, just because that's a spot where there's enough structure to give you guidance and enough structure for you to have rails and mentors and people to look out for, but also small enough that actually there's a lot of room for you to carve out your own space and really thrive if there's something that you feel, incredibly drawn to.
So that first question I wanted to kind of hit on with you is even just to know your background a little bit more. Could you kind of give a summary of the different size engineering teams you've worked along with, and even kind of the size of the company as well?
Sure. Yeah. So the size of the teams that I've worked on has been, very much largely a function of the company size, but also a function of the company's organization, right? So the smallest team that I've worked on was just me and one other person. And so there's one other person full time, and we had a couple of folks who would kind of hop on and off a project for a feature or two. And that was at about a 120 person company, all the way through to actually for a while we deliberately had kind of a big mega team of everybody working on things. And so that was like 19 people on one team. And I will be honest, I did not do a lot of coding at that point. I was mostly, at that point, I'd mostly been doing transition to management, but that's really the spectrum that I've worked on. Aside from once or twice being kind of a co-founder in like a 2 or 3 person company where that was the team because that was the whole company.
Yeah, definitely. So then of the ones that you've kind of worked at along the way, what sort of stage has been your favorite so far when it comes to that size of engineering?
So I think there's a couple of different things that are worth noting, right? One is that the size of the whole engineering team and the size of the specific team that you're working on are often different things. And so I have personally, because I get very excited by, kind of rapidly iterating, trying to find, product market fit and run a bunch of experiments, I've personally thrived the most on very small teams of like, at most 5 people. But I've seen that work very differently as part of a larger engineering team or, when it was the whole engineering team. Right. And so I've thrived the most when it's been the whole engineering team has been 5 people and the company is maybe 10 people and it's very early. And I really enjoy the energy there because everyone's doing a little bit of everything. As an engineer, you're involved in sales conversations, you're involved in customer support, you're involved in really kind of understanding the whole scope of the business and bringing that to your work as an engineer. And with a really small team, you're able to communicate kind of all in one virtual room, all very high bandwidth. Everyone has a lot of context, and it's a very empowering state to be. I've also, been in different situations where there's like 2 or 3 people on a team, but it's a much bigger company. And so the scope of that role is much more constrained, and that has its benefits in that you have a lot of room within that scope to really stretch your creative muscles, but it has its downsides in that scope, again, is pretty constrained.
Sure. And it's kind of a limited group of people that are weighing in on your day-to-day.
Exactly, yeah. And often, depending on the shape of the product and the shape of the project, the decisions that you're making can be kind of moved around at any point, right? So at one point, for example, at a previous company, and I'm sure this will resonate with a lot of folks, we had decided to try one mechanism for doing sort of subscription validation. And at a high level, we were kind of told, no, we need to do something completely different. And that was kind of a directive from on high. And so a bunch of my work for like 2 months was basically thrown away. That didn't feel good.
Got it. So then I'm kind of curious when it comes to those like different stages that you've worked at. Obviously, that kind of ideal size you were saying is 5 folks or so on your team, whether that's the entirety of the engineering team or if that's just kind of the nucleus of the team that you're on under the bracket of engineering. What are kind of the characteristics of a team that is that size? You hit on it a little bit of like kind of that sweet spot of, handful of people weighing in, but tell me a little more on that.
So I think less than 4 people, very often you don't have enough hands, right? You literally just don't have enough different ways to break up the team's focus to potentially work on a larger scoped project. So I like, 4 or 5 people there so that, you can break things up into half a dozen pieces and everyone can own a substantial part of something, and that's in somebody's head rather than having to constrain the scope of things that you work on. Conversely, if there's more than, in my experience, 7 or 8 people, it gets very hard for everyone to have the full context on what everyone else is doing and where they can really jump in and help the most. And so that's why I found 4 or 5 to be a really sweet spot where there's enough hands and enough breadth of experience and enough different, pairs of eyes on things to really get a full collaborative experience and really be able to spread your work in a lot of different ways, but few enough people so that everyone has a lot of context on what everyone else is doing and can jump in and can help, and you can really move forward quickly.
Definitely. So then can you kind of talk through a little bit more of the structure of the teams that you worked on when there were about 5 or so, and that was the entire engineering team at the smaller companies? What kinds of skill sets did you bring in? What did that involve? One product person that was considered to be on the engineering team, so to speak, or like who made up that team?
Yeah, so most of the time when I've been part of a very small team, that's been, there's been one product person who is very technical and who's kind of an engineer. At other companies, there's been kind of a product owner who's associated with an effort. And sometimes that's actually someone from a product definition standpoint. Sometimes that's just someone, with a personal goal, and they're acting as a product owner, even though that's not formally their role. And mostly those have been set up in what I think is mostly standard in most of the companies that I've worked at, which is there's 1 or 2 fairly senior people, of whom one is sort of the nominal lead. And so there's kind of a technical lead and a few folks who, again, nominally respond to that technical lead in terms of a particular goal or sprint structure or Kanban prioritization or whatever you might have.
Got it. Okay. And then in your experience, what are the kind of like traits or characteristics of the folks who would work well in that sort of a smaller engineering team?
I would say that things that help you thrive on a team that size are a desire to own things. So if you, for example, are the kind of person who's very happy to just, do some really interesting work, but not own it long term, and you don't have sort of a vested interest in seeing a project really come to fruition, then that's going to be a little bit harder, because in my experience, those smaller teams often, have to own the whole thing end to end. And so early stage, especially when that's the whole engineering team, you have to own the whole thing, and you have to be pretty committed to the product. And so you have to want to own it or want to own some part of it. I would say also adaptability is really the strongest skill there, just because, again, as a member of a small team, you have to be pretty flexible, where your whole team might be working on completely different things from one project to the next. So all of you might be swarming on a UI bug, all the way down to trying to figure out a deep DevOps infrastructure conundrum.
Sure. And then would you say there's any ideal like stage within their career? So a more junior developer versus more senior working at a smaller team?
For sure. So there's a lot of places in your career where you can benefit from this a lot. I would say my personal opinion is that that's actually a really, really good spot for someone very early in their career, so long as they're willing to, keep a completely open mind and be okay without a ton of structure. And that doesn't necessarily describe everybody. If that's not your comfort zone, I'm not going to say anyone has to jump into that. But especially very early on in your career, that gives you a chance to, try out a whole bunch of different things and really get into the weeds of a bunch of different technologies and a bunch of different places. And also, as a member of a very small team, you get to have maybe an oversized impact compared to the loudness of your voice in a larger team. I will say also, I think that that's a really good spot to be for actually not a super experienced engineer. I would say maybe someone with 5 to 10 years of experience, where most of the folks who I've met who are in that range are seasoned enough to really know what they're good at and want to grow in some directions, but also focus on the sets of skills they can best impart to their team members, or they can share with a group and really be able to make progress on something, and who have, kind of been around the block a couple of times. And so they don't need a lot of guidance when it comes to product definition or estimation or, stakeholder management or some of the other things that are such an important part of being an engineer as part of an organization.
Sure. So then kind of on the flip side, so when you've worked on teams where the engineering team was larger, and like you mentioned, ideally, like your own individual team would hopefully still be small. But let's say like overall engineering might be more like 20 folks, 30 folks, a little bit like bigger in later stage startup. What has that structure kind of looked like, and how have they broken up the teams so that you don't have literally 20 people that are all obviously just working for one tech lead?
Yeah, so that's mostly what I have seen is those. So the largest engineering team as a proportion of the organization that I've worked on has been about 70 odd people total across the whole team. And that engineering organization was broken up pretty distinctly into two major sort of subsections. And then each one of those subsections was broken up into sort of project focused or product line focused teams with a technical lead and one or two product people being part of that. And that's a pretty common structure that I've seen a couple of times. And I would say that's probably the most common is something like that, where you've got a couple of levels of hierarchy.
So then have you noticed any differences in like the folks that might thrive more in that kind of a team environment?
I absolutely have. I think that's a place where it's a little bit bimodal again. If you're relatively early in your career and you're looking for a place where there will be defined mentorship, like there will definitely be specific senior engineers who are there to guide you, where there will be a well-defined catalog of tasks and things for you to jump into and really thrive on without having to, kind of make your own way a little bit, which can be intimidating. And, that's no knock on anybody. I've been intimidated by situations like that. And sometimes I don't want to put in the mental effort. I would say in those situations, a larger company is often a better bet. I would say that, again, for the sweet spot for me has been a company that's maybe 3 or 4 years old and really sort of in the 70 to 110 person range in terms of size, just because that's a spot where there's enough structure to give you guidance and enough structure for you to have rails and mentors and people to look out for as an early career engineer, but also small enough that actually there's a lot of room for you to carve out your own space and really thrive if there's something that you feel, incredibly drawn to, or a skill that you discover that you're awesome at.
I'm kind of curious too, if you could kind of like define those different stages of startup engineering teams. We've hit on, a few of them along the way, but can you kind of walk through starting with that early stage small team? Maybe it is just a few engineers in total at the company, and then kind of like walk through how they progress through those stages.
Sure. And so I think a lot of this, I'm going to throw in a big grain of salt here, which is a lot of this depends so heavily on the shape of the business and on the needs of the organization. So, for example, an organization that I worked with before, you could have a company that's building fundamentally a pretty straightforward product. And so their engineering team might be relatively small compared to other functions in the organization, just because the actual value of the product is not in the engineering, right? It's in the customer enablement, right? Or in the training to use the tool so that a whole industry can be disrupted by just, a tool with a high learning curve, but that's extraordinarily effective. What I've mostly seen is, you've got the very early stage group where your team is less than 7, let's say, and that's often very early on, and that can certainly be extended. But I have rarely seen a startup that's deliberately trying to grow as a company be less than 7 people for more than, let's say, 2 years. So after that, they're almost certainly growing as a team as well as a company. And then I would say the next stage there is sort of 7 to 15, where you're getting to that point where actually you do need to, previous to this, you could follow the aphorism of feeding a team with 2 pizzas, right? 2 pizzas would feed your whole team, you're great. Sort of 7 to 15 is a transition point because you have to break up the team in some fashion to focus on whether that's skill sets or product objectives or different product owners. Either way, you have to break up the team in some fashion. So that's a transition point. I would say beyond that, you've got sort of 15 to 40 odd is another range where you get to another transition point where even with very experienced tech leads, you've often outgrown the ability of a single director or head of engineering or someone to oversee all of those things, just because there's enough stuff going on. And you've ideally got, 6 or 7 tech leads over your teams at this point with relatively small teams. there's enough going on that a single director or head of engineering can't really keep a good handle on that. And so I would say beyond that, you grow to the next stage where you have multiple sort of levels of hierarchy and multiple directors overseeing different groups of functionality. I haven't seen the next level beyond that in my experience, but I would imagine that next level would come at about 150 or so engineers.
Okay. Well, that was super helpful. Those are the main questions I wanted to cover with you. Do you have just kind of any last takeaways that you'd want to share with folks that are trying to find that sweet spot of a company to work at?
So there's really two things that I think are worth mentioning. One is just I highly recommend trying something. If you're in a position to try something, try a size of company or a size of team that you haven't tried before, I strongly recommend doing it just to get a sense of how well that sits with you. I would also say that different team sizes and different company sizes require different styles of communication, where if you are, for example, a relatively small team in a relatively small company where everything's relatively flat, where you're communicating more formally because you actually have to communicate across the whole company. And so you, as let's say the leader of a 5-person team, are actually communicating to the entirety of a 100-person company with your project updates, where it's relatively flat and everyone's in kind of a pool, and you're sending effectively memos to the whole team. And depending on the size and structure of that organization, your communication styles are going to vary. So conversely, you might find yourself in a tiny team within a really, really big organization where your team is small enough that you're just, sending gifts to each other on Slack and, responding to pull requests with emoji. All of that, the structure and the formality and the communication channels are isolated from you, and you're really just getting kind of structured updates.